Hey, everybody. Welcome into an all-new episode of Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And indictment-free, I am Nick Severi.
Oh, well, you tee it up. I hit it out of the park. On the program today, with 4 indictments under his belt, former President Trump, he takes to the teleprompter, Nick. Nick and I are going to weigh in on the former president's message to Americans. I'm sure it's sane and rational. Plus, the first GOP debate is upcoming this week. Nick and I will set the stage for the candidates that will be on that debate stage Wednesday night in Milwaukee on Fox News. Plus, later on the program, former federal prosecutor and CNN senior legal analyst and the host of the Third Degree podcast, our buddy Elie Honig, is back to break down everything that happened with the Georgia indictments and the 19 defendants. So Ellie's going to help us break down everything from the legal perspective upcoming in our next segment. Nick, how you doing, man? Since we recorded, this always happens. This literally always happens to our show. We record an episode, something's about to happen or is kind of like on the precipice. And you and I, we just do something because we're on the East Coast. It's too late to stay up. And so the Georgia indictment breaks in the wee hours of the morning. All the news networks are doing it, coverage of it, and all their 38 legal analysts that they have on breaking this all down. And then 2 political commentators like Van Jones for some reason. And you and I couldn't actually stay awake to break all this down. So now here we are about a week later, and the indictments in Georgia, RICO statute implemented here, 19 co-defendants, Mark Meadows, Jenna Ellis, all these other people. Normally I say hello to you, but like, what's your first reaction here of everything that happened with the indictments that came down last week after we finished recording?
Well, first off, I'm ashamed of Twitter or X or whatever you're calling it now. You know, I saw a lot of like jokes about like the RICO, which of course talks about is a racketeering component, folks, if you're legally speaking. So I saw people making like the Ricola jokes, for like the lozenge.
Right.
I must be too old, folks. Clearly the joke to go with is Rico Suave. And no one picked up on it.
Yeah.
I'm like, I can't, the song is in my head as I'm saying this out loud, and no one brought it up. I was like, I guess it's going to be me. I don't know. Total missed opportunity. But on a serious note, obviously, when we wrapped the show, I was adamant about the fact, because it's so easy when this stuff breaks as it relates to the former president to say, well, here's another thing he's guilty of or whatever. No, we don't know. That's the whole purpose of this. Is there enough information or is there enough evidence to go to trial? And in 4 of these cases, or all of these cases, the answer is yes. But at the time that we wrapped up, we didn't know the names for these indictments. We know indictments were, came through. Grand jury's made a decision. They're going to move forward. So we don't know if the president is going to be the former president's going to be on the list. And of course, lo and behold, it was, along with a whole bunch of other people. And Mike, the thing I texted you was when I looked at all the charges, there was 2 that really stood out that were very black and white in the sense of, I don't think you can make an argument of whether you did it or not. It seems pretty clear if it happened. And one of which was impersonating an officer. And the second one was forgery. Those seem to me, again, I'm not a lawyer and people have, really expensive lawyers that are going to try to, bail them out on this. These seem like pretty cut and dry things. Yeah. And this was the one we heard, Mike. I'll go back to you on this one, but this was the one every legal analyst that came on the show said, George is the one that the Trump team is probably most worried about.
Yep. And next segment, Elie Honig was one of those voices that has been on this program earlier in the year when he was promoting his book, Untouchable, How Powerful People Get Away With It, because that's a common question he gets asked. We asked him about which one's keeping you up at night. And the Georgia one was the one that he pointed to long before we knew really the severity of the documents case and anything else pertaining to New York or anything else that's happened now with January 6th and that indictment as well. So what I wanted to do here in our first segment before we actually get into a preview of the GOP field, if anybody can overtake the former president, I did want to get into the former president having a battle with a teleprompter. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe you haven't seen this, but a couple of days after the indictments came down, former President Trump announced that he would be having a press conference on this Monday, where this episode that you're listening to right now is out. stating all of the reasons why the indictment in Georgia should be immediately dropped. Well, over the weekend, we came to find out that they actually, as his lawyers told him, they were not going to do that. Maybe because they don't have the evidence, or maybe because the lawyers were like, how about we do this in the court of law instead of here? So he took to social media, his platform, Truth Social, and he went into everything that's happening with the Biden administration, the Department of Justice, and then Georgia Attorney General Fani Willis. Take a listen to this.
Full subpoena power because of the freedom of speech sham indictment by crooked Joe Biden, deranged Jack Smith and the DOJ. It has just been reported that the unselect January 6th committee, they are unselect indeed, of political hacks and thugs, has illegally destroyed all of their records and their documents. So they took all of their records, all of their documents, they reported it, tried to get me indicted, and probably did, and then they destroyed everything. This is unthinkable, and the fake political indictment against me must be immediately withdrawn. The system is rigged and corrupt, very much like the presidential election of 2020, and we have plenty of proof on that. We are a nation in decline, but we'll turn it around. We have no choice.
So you heard a bunch there, and the first thing that came to mind with me was they crammed way too many buzzwords and phrases in the prompter for the former president. You could tell he was tripping over some of the buzz phrases, right? He couldn't wait to say corrupt or Biden's DOJ or deranged Jack Smith. He's got his nicknames, but you can't put them all in sequential order for him because he's going to trip over some of them and not get them off like as the crowd would want him to get those nicknames off. You just can't put all of that stuff into one sheet for the former president. It's making me laugh, but it's very sad that this is what it's come to now, that the front runner for one of the major political parties here in the United States is resorting to buzzwords and phrases and just repeating this language, and people are soaking it up. We're going to find out over the next 12 to 16 months if anybody else that's maybe a moderate or independent actually will vote for somebody that's reading something like that off of a prompter. Nick, what do you make of Donald Trump running to Truth Social, posting this, the presser that was supposed to happen this week that now is not going to happen? We've seen how many cases with respect to the election of 2020 have either been thrown out or have not even made it to the levels of the Supreme Court, and 60 cases plus in a bunch of different states, all thrown out. No evidence, including Attorney General Bill Barr saying after he left the Trump administration, there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud. Maybe a case here or there of somebody ripping up a ballot, stuff like that. We're going to get to that in just a sec with one key piece of evidence in this Georgia case. But what do you make of the president first announcing the presser, canceling the presser, and now all of a sudden going to Truth Social and reading buzzwords and phrases that were written by probably Stephen Miller or somebody in the president's camp, and he just couldn't get all the nicknames off in time?
Oftentimes when I hear the former president try to defend himself, obviously I don't agree with him. Most of the time, he does a playful job of trying to evade the truth, and you sometimes can get the sense that this is not really affecting him and that he has an excuse or he has some way of dodging this. Now, by contrast, you listen to someone like Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy, who every time he talks sounds like there's something functionally broken in his brain. And there's a contrast here because in the case of Lindell, there's someone who just sounds like a cartoon character. There's nothing sensible about what this guy has to say. Whereas the former president has this way of presenting himself as being untruthful, but not being crazy, for lack of a better phrase. Mike, what you just played is probably the first time where I'm hearing truly desperation, and I'm hearing a person who just sounds unhinged at this point. And couple that with the request to take the federal case from Jack Smith's office, to 2026, April 2026, and moving it back, which probably won't happen. And you just have someone who looks like he's grasping at straws now. Just take apart what he said, right? We're going to destroy evidence. Now, let me get this straight. They're going to destroy this evidence from January 6th. before a trial takes place where they're going to have to show it. How does that make any sense? You come back and say, well, the election of 2020 was rigged. This is why, by the way, he has to stand on all this nonsense. Mike, you've used the word pot committed as it references members at Fox News, who may be decent people, but have to fight on that lie, as Slim Charles had once famously said on The Wire. That's what the former president is now. The big lie was for fundraising purposes and to keep that base rabid. Because if you didn't keep them engaged, if you simply acquiesced and said, yeah, I took my L on November 2020, I hope, America, makes it through the next 4 years. Maybe I'll be back. Some of this stuff may not even be a legal matter. But this guy does not take the loss, starts calling offices, asking for 11,000 votes, which obviously will play at some point, but is so defensive, so evasive, and just absolutely blindingly foolish in his reaction. And you've brought this up a couple of times on the show before, Mike, where there's a sensible option to talk about you could talk about inflation, you could talk about crime. There are talking points sensibly that you could make, and he's made none of them. All he has done every time the camera points to him, and I don't know why we keep talking to this person. Yes, he's a former president, but there's nothing sensible that he's saying right now. All he is saying is the election was rigged. I'm the target of these investigations. Brother, it's one thing if it was one case that you want to say, well, the world is out, the judge is out against me and blah, blah, blah. 4. We're up to 4 now. How many arguments are you going to make that this is also a massive witch hunt? 4. That's 4 times the amount that any former president's ever had to deal with. I don't know what to say other than the fact that he just continues to sound less and less sensible about this. And you can't have an intellectual conversation here. I mean, we're talking about someone who just sounds outright crazy now.
First, a couple of things. He's recording these videos. So these are videos that he's posting himself, or his team is posting to his Truth Social platform. So I've always said this, so let's give him credit for this. I've always said this to people that complain about Twitter and Facebook and don't understand content moderation policies that those privately owned companies have. You can start your own thing. You can start your own platform and you can start your own app. He did all of that and he's getting his message out there. I agree with you. It's very incoherent. And just like I said, you can't put that many buzzwords and phrases into the prompter for him. It's like Ron Burgundy. He shuts down and he doesn't know, or he'll read everything in the prompter, but he won't read it with the type of tone and inflection that you want to get out of it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I agree totally with you about what you said. If this was just a New York case, which we've had legal analysts come on here and say statute of limitations is probably up for that case. It's against the Trump organization. Again, this was campaign funds that weren't properly marked. Every talking point that any Republican has hit on about that. And legal analysts, have pointed to that it's not as serious, or, anybody else would maybe be facing misdemeanor charges out of this. 100%. I would agree with you. Hey, this is maybe politically motivated because the previous DA didn't bring charges against this. And Elie, in the next segment, we'll talk to him about that because he's friends with Alvin Bragg. So he knows full well what it took for Alvin to actually bring these charges against him. But 4 of them, 2 at the federal level, Florida, DC, and then obviously the state level one with Georgia. And the RICO statute, we're going to get into that with Elie in a bit. It's not that hard to prove down there, which is why they did this and lumped all these folks together. One thing I did want to do here, Nick, is actually get into the Georgia indictment itself by playing some of the key pieces of evidence. I think we've all kind of heard the former president talking to the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, asking him to find 11,000 votes, or at least all he wants to do is find 11,500 and however many votes it was. So the grand jury puts the indictment, 41 counts, 19 people named in it, including a bunch of his attorneys, John Eastman, Rudy Giuliani, Jenna Ellis. All of these folks, after 75 witnesses were all heard from in this grand jury, the indictments come down, and everyone has pointed to What the prosecution will probably show, not probably, they'll definitely show it. And they're going to do it hopefully like I done it, which is cut up segments from an hour and 2 minute phone conversation that the former president, his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and a couple of his attorneys all had with the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, and the attorneys down there in Georgia as well. But what I wanted to do here, Nick, and for our audience, was actually play parts of this. Now, I don't know how many people have heard the full version. You can go check it out on YouTube. All the major news organizations have posted it on their YouTube channels. We're going to play some of it here from you, from the introduction level to what the former president alleges a couple of different times to what Brad Raffensperger actually responds back. So I want to play it now, and Nick and I are going to react on the other side. Take a listen to this.
On the line is Secretary of State and two other individuals, Jordan and Mr. Germany. With him, you also have the attorneys that represent the president, Kurt and Alex, and Cleta Mitchell, who is not the attorney of record but has been involved, myself, and then the president. So, Mr. President, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, Brad and Ryan and everybody. We appreciate the time and the call. So we've spent a lot of time on this, and if we could just go over some of the numbers, I think it's pretty clear that we won. We won very substantially, Georgia. You even see it by rally size, frankly. We'd be getting 25,000, 30,000 people a rally, and the competition would get less than 100 people, and it never made sense. But we have a number of things. We have at least two or three, anywhere from 250 to 300,000 ballots were dropped mysteriously into the rolls. Much of that had to do with Fulton County, which hasn't been checked. We think that if you check the signatures, a real check of the signatures going back in Fulton County, you'll find at least a couple of 100,000 of forged signatures of people with who have been forged. But you also have substantial numbers of people, thousands and thousands, who went to the voting place on November 3rd, were told they couldn't vote. Were told they couldn't vote because a ballot had been put in on their name. And, that's very, 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 very sad. You had absentee ballot sent to vacant. They were absentee ballots sent to vacant addresses. They had nothing on them about addresses. That's 2,326. But politicians in every state, but politicians in Georgia have given affidavits and are going to that there was no way they beat me in the election, that the people came out. In fact, they were expecting to lose. And this may or may not be true. This just came up this morning, that they are burning their ballots, that they are shredding ballots and removing equipment. They're changing the equipment on the Dominion machines.
President Trump, we've had several lawsuits, and we've had to respond in court to the lawsuits and the contentions. We don't agree that you have one. I didn't agree about the 200,000 number that you mentioned. I don't believe that you're really questioning the Dominion machines, because we did a hand retally, a 100% retally of all the ballots, and compared that to what the machine said, and it came up with virtually the same result. Then we did the recount, and we got virtually the same result. So I guess we could probably take that off the table. I don't think there's an issue about that.
So like I was mentioning, I encourage a lot of people out there to go to YouTube, type in, President Trump's phone call with Brad Raffensperger. You could probably see it on Washington Post's site. They've posted the full hour and 2-minute phone conversation. I wanted to spotlight the Brennan Center because you can go to brennancenter.org to check out the fact checking that was done on a lot of the points that you heard there that the former president said. I want to get to a couple of them, Nick, before you chime in here. He said you had absentee ballots that were sent to vacant addresses. They had nothing on them, about 2,326. Later on in the phone call, the Secretary of State Raffensperger explained to him that the data was wrong. Georgia and other states use a wide range of procedures to make sure that requests for mail ballots come only from currently registered voters, and they take steps to reduce errors when sending mail ballots including routine maintenance of voter rolls. So this is according to the Brenner Center research that has been done. Now, he claimed about the Dominion machines, and obviously we know about the lawsuit with Fox News and all of that, and that settlement for $787 million. He says in the clip that you just heard, they are burning their ballots. They are shredding the ballots, removing equipment. They're changing the equipment on the Dominion machines. And, that's not legal. According to the Brennan Center, both Fox News and the former president knew that the claims about Dominion held no merit. Election officials in Georgia employ rigorous federal and state testing and certification practices both before and after elections to prevent fraud and machine errors. And now, quick correction by me there. That is Dominion that posted that about the election officials employing rigorous federal and state testing and certification practices. But obviously, Georgia's the one administering the testing practices. One other thing I wanted to point to, he mentioned about the election workers that were fired for shredding, or I forget what he says now, because as you mentioned earlier, Nick, he says so many different things that it's very tough to fact check the stuff in real time, as we're trying to do right now. He had mentioned about shredding the votes. There were 2 election workers who were under fire that they were working in Fulton County, and they had been fired for shredding voter registration forms, not actual ballots, registration forms. But again, as everyone's trying to fact check this stuff in real time, and both workers were dismissed a few days after the election process, or at least when the runoff stuff was happening. So during that October into November window, it fed into this whole elections rigged and they're shredding ballots conversation that the former president, you just heard in the video, and the audio, that he was saying there. So those are some of the claims there. Like I mentioned, BrennanCenter.org. If you just want to learn a little bit more about some of the things he mentioned, he said something about drop boxes in there. He said that there was voter impersonation and close to 5,000 people that were voting. And obviously there was no proof of that. The Brennan Center debunked those allegations of dead voter fraud and voter impersonation. It's extraordinarily rare, according to every reputable, not only news outlet, but source that's actually fact checking this stuff. There's identification verification safeguards, such as signature matching, that provides additional layers of protection against voter impersonation. All states regularly update their voter rolls to remove deceased voters, and they base those removals on data obtained from state and federal agencies. That's according to Georgia's website. So, mouthful that I just said there, Nick, but I think it's important for the listeners out there, people watching us on YouTube. You know how many comments we get. I texted you a photo the other day of a comment on one of our videos. So we posted it for 10 minutes. It sat out there, 78 comments later and 2,000 views because of some of the hashtags that we put on this stuff, and the content comes in and you get a lot of the trolls on social media that are just regurgitating some of the talking points that we heard from the former president in the beginning of this segment. And then you hear on the phone call, he's listing talking points of things that are easily refutable and were refuted in real time in the phone call by the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger there. What do you make of the phone call in its entirety? Because I'm not even sure if you've heard it. I know I've never heard it fully, other than a few news outlets that have played maybe, 4 or 5 minutes snippets at a time. Listening to it earlier today and hearing a podcast talk about, I would encourage people to go listen to this. And I was like, you know what? I am going to go listen to it today. Well, let's talk about it on the show. And I was like, damn, these are the same points that he is saying now. And again, when he's saying it then, we still were into the ability for the former president to challenge the results of the election, which he's allowed to do up until a certain point, right? Concession is not written down anywhere. You don't actually have to concede. You can continue with all your legal challenges, but once you've exhausted all of them, okay, now it's time to hang it up. And he is regurgitating points from 2023 that he was saying on that phone call in 2020 with no actual proof. So what do you make of everything that I just played there from the former president and that phone call in Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking, I was looking at, the charges, and the former president has, I mean, you're looking here. I mean, it's several to put it lightly. So, the thing about the phone call, specifically that clip, I need to find 11,000 votes. Right now, I'm not saying exactly the way he said it, but it was pretty close. When you listen to that call, just the part you just played. So let's look at some of the charges for the former president. So charge one is violation of the Georgia RICO Act, which stands for racketeering, influence, and corrupt organizations. Okay, so it's the idea that the former president, was in on this with other people. Probably tough to prove, but that's one of the charges there. Charge 5 is solicitation of violation of oath by public officer. That one's crucial because think about the clip. First off, let's go with the clip you just played. So the former president puts forward falsehoods. Now, at that moment in the clip, he's not asking for people to do anything about that. Not yet. That comment about the 11,000 votes is where charge 5 probably comes from. But as we heard in the tape, though, it's already being refuted. A retally had taken place, a hand retally, a recount had taken place, and the person whose voice you hear is telling the soon-to-be former president, you ain't got it. We've done all of it. There's no corruption here, and refutes the former president. Then you look at charge 9. Charge 9 is conspiracy to commit impersonating a public officer. So now you're getting into, we're going to try to work the system so that we're going to get people to speak on our behalf who happen to be employed, in the state of Georgia. Then you go over to what we have here. We got count 11. Count 11 is conspiracy to commit forgery in the first degree. So this gets into the idea that, we're going to start just writing up documents to prove this stuff, right? To prove our case. But the idea of conspiracy is where there, and this is the thing I think it's going to be tough to prove, is did all these people agree to move forward with a plan? That's always going to be the tricky part. So as you were playing that tape, I was just reading these charges and I'm like, I see where the prosecutor is coming from. I understand the idea that when you listen to a phone call like that and someone is saying, I need you to get me votes, and here are these fallacious stories I'm going to put forward to prove it. And as cavalier as he put it, we've had evidence of this, we have evidence of that. Again, it's a Mike Lindell impression. And the state of Georgia, to their credit, heard that and said, no, we don't have that here. That did not happen. I forgot the exact phrasing, but the guy said, we can't move forward with that. It just didn't take place. So I credit the state of Georgia, but I also am looking at this list of charges and I'm just checking the boxes as you're playing the tape. And I totally understand at least the intent of what, they're putting forward. Now, obviously there was enough evidence to move forward to trial, but none of this is surprising so far.
It's so tough listening to these phone calls. Because again, the big thing that I've noticed on television, especially watching, conservative media and listening to conservative media outlets that are further to the right than traditional ones, is the whataboutism game with Hillary Clinton and Al Gore in the 2000 election. And again, both of those folks exhausted legal options available to them, mainly Gore. Hillary Clinton obviously conceded, took it back, was still waiting for some counting, and then conceded later on in the wee hours of the morning. I forget how the timeline went, but regardless, she ended up calling Donald Trump to concede. Al Gore exhausted legal options based on something that happened actually where I live here in Miami-Dade County. And there's a great documentary out there, 537 votes, you can go check out on Max, that our friend Alfred Spellman and Billy Corbin have done about what happened during the 2000 recount. But Al Gore exhausted his legal options, and eventually his team said, we don't have it. We're not going to have enough votes. And they conceded to George W. Bush. That's been the talking point that I've noticed in a lot of different places. The whataboutism game, again, the former president is within his right to have legal challenges. You have to have proof. The court of public opinion is one thing. You can say whatever you want on television, depending upon if the senior producer or executive producer will allow it to make it to air, or even the anchor, as we've seen Jake Tapper before cut off some things that were airing on CNN. But that doesn't mean that you can say those things in the court of law. As we saw with Rudy Giuliani in the Georgia case, I believe, or when they were bringing a legal challenge to one of the cases, it was either Pennsylvania or Georgia, and the judge had asked them a question about how many folks for the Republican side, for the Trump campaign, were actually in the room to be able to count the votes. When you're doing a recount process, you're supposed to have somebody representing you. And he said there was a non-zero number of folks if you remember this quote. And the judge was like, what the hell does that mean? I'm paraphrasing now. And he said, no, there was actually somebody there representing us. You can say whatever you want in public. You just can't say it in the court of law because you have to have facts behind it. Former president doesn't have that in his side. Yes, one more, Mr. Zaveri, for you before we get into the folks that could potentially unseat him as the GOP primary debate comes up on the 23rd. One more, Mr. Zaveri. Yes.
Yeah, real quick. This draws the parallel to me because you mentioned, on the other side of this argument, conservatives and pro-Trump supporters will argue, well, what about Hillary Clinton? What about Al Gore? This is the same thing we heard with the documents case, right? Mike Pence, Joe Biden. It's like, well, what about them? They did the exact same thing. And Joe Rogan said something stupid like that too. And in both cases, there's something definitive that the former president did that the other two didn't do. Show me the example of where Al Gore or former Secretary of State Clinton called someone and said, hey, get me 11,000 votes. Show me the transcript of that.
Not going to find that.
Right. Show me the person who went forward and said, well, here's the information I have and blah, blah, blah. And then, the state comes back and says, no, none of that's true. Mike, it was when that guy, fired back at what the president had said. I had a flashback to that scene in Billy Madison when the guy, says, I award you no points and may God have mercy on your soul. That's exactly what that was. It's a much shortened version of what you just said has made us all dumber.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is the same thing, but we hear this all the time. Well, Trump did nothing different than these other people. Yes, he did. Clearly he did. And it's enough evidence to say that this particular case needs to go forward, which is what's happening.
Yep. You're absolutely right. If not, there'd be no indictments. If he had not taken it further and if he had just exhausted legal options and conceded, we are probably not here. And again, you make a great analogy, right? Find that Democratic candidate that actually went through those same steps, calling a former Secretary of State. All right, let's get into the folks that could potentially unseat the former president before we make it to November of 2024. The debate is happening this week. We're going to have a special episode coming out on the Thursday right after the debate. Former Democratic strategist and Fox News contributor Marie Harf and former Republican strategist and obviously an advisor to House Speaker John Boehner and Representative Adam Kinzinger, Maura Gillespie are going to be joining us. We're going to do a breakdown of everything that happened in the debates, key moments, some reaction, some of the messages, if there's any spicy moments, all of that we're going to be covering for you in our special episode that's going to air later this week. But the 8 candidates that have qualified so far to be on the debate stage, former President Donald Trump, who's already said, or at least has hinted that he's not going to be there and is going to be doing a counter interview with former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, which will be in parallel at the same time that is happening. But the people that have qualified for the debate stage are so far my governor here in the state of Florida, Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, and then obviously former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. There's a few more folks. Oh, and former Vice President Mike Pence. There's a few more folks that are waiting to see if they can qualify, such as Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. Again, as of this recording, he has not qualified, but he's very close. So I'd be shocked if he's not there. And then obviously former Congressman Will Hurd. There's even Miami Mayor Francis Suarez. He's polling less than what I have right now in my wallet, which is $0. So there's no way he's going to make it there. So I know you're laughing there. It's a very good joke by me, by the way. I don't carry cash, folks. So let me ask you, Nick, as we prepare for this, and we're going to be breaking down everything that happens in the debates, I've pointed to 2015 and the primaries for the GOP as the turning point here in this country. That'll be the hill that I die on because I was glued intently to that. And I think from those primary debates, a star was born in the former president because people got to see what it was like to be unfiltered, not structured, not following a script, not following talking points, just being fast and loose with words, giving people nicknames. And all of this stuff has been part of the allure of the former president, in my opinion, because he came from the world of television. He had been a star with The Apprentice, and everyone knew him from that. Or you saw him on Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, and everybody had some type of illusion of Donald Trump as this television star. He's been in Home Alone 2. He's made cameos here and there. And then he gets out there and he wowed people, not so much with policy, but he wowed them with the ability to counter folks. And then he did it again in the debates to Hillary Clinton on the tax code. So in this upcoming debate, he won't be a part of that. But this is the one that the actual voters will be watching, right? So who from this stage do you think can actually make a dent? What is it that you're looking forward to in this first debate? Who's a candidate that maybe is sticking out to you that is staying away from the buzzwords and phrases and maybe focusing on the kitchen table issues, as I like to say, and the policies that the GOP fancies himself on?
It's Chris Christie, and it's not close. I'm not a fan of the former governor. I am a former resident of state of New Jersey, although I'm New Jersey through and through, right? Born and raised. So, but I've heard a lot of clips from the former governor, and some of the town halls he's done, I think he's been on message. I mean, he's been very clear about where he stands on the former president. Now, obviously, what other people on the stage are going to probably do is bring up the fact that, well, you were for him before you're against him, right? It's the John Kerry argument. But everyone I've heard, Christie has probably done the most masterful job of putting the former president really in their place in context in terms of he lied. This is what happened. Jan 6th. It is what it is. Boom. Whereas someone like Ron DeSantis has struggled with trying to be open about January 6th. There was a clip of him, I think I was either on Rogan or somewhere, I don't know, where he downplays it and says, well, it wasn't an insurrection. These were some peaceful people, ... And it's obviously, well, he's trying to court Trump supporters in Florida. So, and then there's obviously, Vivek Ramaswamy, who doesn't get the invite to the Indian Cookout anymore, by the way. But it's trying to come at it from more the standpoint of, anti-wokeism. He's a more capable and more intellectually sound version of Ron DeSantis in terms of, again, the anti-woke platform is a silly platform. It's a pointless one. But that's the one he's been on. And lately, Vivek is now talking about like what he defines marriage as, or he said it in some version or another. Again, brilliant guy, has a business mind. Talk about the flipping economy. Like there's other things. Oh, and let's get into the fact that very briefly, apparently he's a sympathizer to Putin, which, I mean, I'll let you all look that up and maybe we'll just play a clip of it at some other point. But he's a little all over the place, and he falls into the trap of what I think DeSantis is trying to do, is just grabbing all the Trump talking points. Although I think Trump's actually, spoken a little more clearly on, the situation in Russia. Again, don't agree with him, but not all over the map like DeSantis and Vivek is. But Christie has been the one that has sounded the most crystal clear. I think Mike Pence still seems to be doing a revisionist history tour about his role with January 6th. About now he seems to be irate and upset about the former president, asking for potentially his death on January 6th. And it's like, well, where was this energy, on January 5th or whatever? And then, of course, you have Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, I kind of equate as having very similar talking points about, what's wrong with Democrats and, trying to unite the party. But their voice got overshadowed by Christie and Vivek. If I was on, one of the two premier betting sites, I would put my money that that Christie walks out of this debate with either the biggest bump or gets declared the winner outright.
Well, a couple things there. Vivek, to me, and again, we've invited a few of these candidates on, Vivek Ramaswamy, Governor Christie, we've invited Will Hurd on. A few of them have said, because of debate preps, that they would like to come on afterwards in the coming months. I would argue that I think Vivek will probably get the biggest bump. I told you this off air. And the reason I say it is because he did a News Nation town hall recently, and they got pretty decent ratings. There was a poll that was done. I don't know if it was by Fox News or CNN, but it was a poll of Republican voters of who has swayed them the most in speeches over the last, couple of months of this cycle of, doing these tours. And Vivek and President Trump were tied at 78% of the people surveyed in that poll. They were tied. I forget how the poll was conducted, so my math could be off, folks. But DeSantis was a close third, but it was really Vivek and President Trump that were neck and neck. And I've heard him speak now on a few different podcasts. Again, some of the policy things, I'm with you. I think that he is wild in terms of the foreign policy stuff. I wouldn't say he's a Putin sympathizer. I would say he's adjacent to whatever that is, in that he thinks Putin should be given the land that he invaded, which makes no sense to me. But his counter logic is to dissuade Russia from having relationships with China, which he thinks is the bigger threat. And so he thinks placating to that is the way to get Putin in our good graces. Again, he's not a foreign policy expert. Neither are you, neither am I. We'll have somebody on to break that down and see if that makes sense. Yes.
Well, I'm smart enough to remember Neville Chamberlain made the same stupid argument about Hitler in Czechoslovakia in 1938, right? Like, what is that? Well, let's just give the baby what he wants because maybe it'll be a little less harmful.
Yes.
It's moronic. And then, again, he's not invited to cook at it anymore. I'm telling you this on behalf of all Indian people.
Again, the policy of appeasement, we've all learned it in our history classes back then. So anyway, I think he will make the biggest splash because I do think, and you've said this to me as well, too, even though he's not invited to the cookout, he has the most television presence and can speak. He's your typical TED Talk guy that you go on YouTube and you watch him talk, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're 28 minutes into his video, and you don't even know maybe what he has said, but you know you can't look away. And so I do think that he will have that effect. And that's the problem, because I've mentioned this about in 2015. John Kasich was always answering right after the former president with policy measures that he did in Ohio that actually could have appealed to moderates and independents, but he just happened to go after the Dave Chappelle, Jerry Seinfeld comedian, and he wasn't able to get his message across because he was the secondary act as opposed to what they all saw in Donald Trump. And I think the same thing's going to happen to Governor Chris Christie, unfortunately, if history repeats itself. So we're going to find out how that all unfolds. We'll have our special episode of the first GOP primary debate. You can check it out Wednesday night at 9 p.m., August 23rd on Fox News with our buddy Brett Baer and Martha McCallum. When we come back after the break, another buddy of ours, CNN senior legal analyst and former federal prosecutor, Elie Honig. He's going to break down everything we just talked about in the Georgia indictments. Nick and I are not lawyers. Let's bring one on, Elie, when we come back after the break.
Your website should be a marketing asset, not an engineering challenge. Empowering everyone from independent designers to whole marketing teams, Webflow combines the power of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and places them all in a completely visual canvas. Trusted by companies like Lattice and Discord, it changes the way marketers, designers, and engineers create for the web. Now you can build the site you want without the dev time. Start building for free at webflow.com.
This episode is presented by our friends, our good friends, over at Fresh Roasted Coffee. The coffee that's keeping me awake when Nick Savari's putting me to sleep with one of his trains of thought. You give me a look here, Nick. Give me a little bit of how Fresh Roasted Coffee keeps you awake when I'm boring you with some of my trains of thought.
Okay, thank you. An interesting introduction. Folks, I'm a huge fan, as you all know, of Fresh Roasted Coffee, primarily for the simple fact about diversity. If you're a tea person, they've got you covered. If you're a coffee person, they got you covered too. Mike and I take our coffee very differently. Mike is a Keurig man. That is efficient. That is tasty. That's the way to go. I am a French press person. Nowadays, I actually grind my own beans. So when I get my batch of fresh roasted coffee, it goes right into the grinder, then to the French press, boiled water, let's go. But in either case, our cup of coffee comes out delicious. Mostly because they ask you at the jump, just tell us about you. Simple quiz. They'll direct you to the bean or brand that you should be getting in touch with. And that's the way to go. And then they just produce an incredible cup of coffee, again, regardless of how you do it.
No, that's exactly right. You can take the quiz over at freshroastedcoffee.com. And in the show notes page right now of this episode, hit the link for a discount or enter in the promo code after you've taken the quiz, after you've selected the coffee you're going to order. Enter in the promo code, can we please get 20 for 20% off your first purchase. I'm telling you, this coffee is delicious. Go to freshroastedcoffee.com today. All right, folks, there's only so far my criminal justice minor from Rutgers University can take us to break down legal news. So we got to turn to the expert, the big boy, the senior legal analyst over at CNN, former DOJ prosecutor. He's got tons of books out there, hosted the Third Degree podcast, our buddy Elie Honig. Elie, thanks for hopping on the podcast with me.
So it's great to see you, Mike. Can I have to tell your audience a story of when we met in person. So I had done this podcast with you a couple times but never met you in person. And I'm walking through the Chicago airport 2 or 3 months ago, maybe. And you stopped me and I recognized you. And you, as a true loyal son of Rutgers, were wearing Rutgers garb. I was caught straying. I was wearing a shirt that I will say in my defense was very, very comfortable that my daughter had got for me when she was on a trip from another university that we used to compete with back when we were in the Big East. Should I say? I'm so embarrassed.
No, don't say it.
I put it in. It was a Georgetown shirt. So I posted something on Instagram, like at least one of us is loyal to Fair Rutgers.
That's right. I always will be loyal to, as a proud son on the banks of the old Raritan there. All right, now, Elie, let's get into why you got your degree from there and why we turn to you now to break down news. I want to ask you real quick before I actually get into the Georgia indictments, the former president overall, these 4 cases. I've been seeing you so much on TV, breaking it down from a calendar perspective, what he's going to be facing. But for you, as a former DOJ official, how do you feel when you first saw the indictment news break in Georgia? Now that you've had about a week to kind of digest everything, you weren't awake till midnight reading all the charges. You've been very vocal about Fani Willis. Maybe you should not even look to pursue this because this is kind of covered in Jack Smith's indictment about the 1-6 stuff. What do you make overall of the Georgia indictments as we're about to break it down in a sec?
I think they're a powerful statement by Fani Willis. I think the indictment alleges a lot of conduct that probably is criminal. It's an awkward fit for some of the Georgia laws. I understand why in a vacuum she would bring this case, but I do stand by my argument that you alluded to, which is I'm not sure I see the necessity in the broader sense, because Jack Smith of DOJ has already charged the effort to steal the election in 7 states, including Georgia and beyond. And there's really not much that's new or different in Fani Willis's indictment. Yes, she's charging state law. He charged federal laws. And, I'm going to articulate what the other side says. People say, well, Fani Willis has a right and a duty and an obligation to charge violations of state law. And I say, yes. But prosecutors also do have a lot of discretion. And one of the written policies of DOJ is we try not to pile on. There's a policy at DOJ called the Pettit policy that says if a certain person has already been charged for conduct, substantially the same conduct in another jurisdiction, generally speaking, we're not going to add on our own charges because prosecutorial discretion and a general sense of fair play. It's not an absolute rule, but it's a general practice, and I think a good one. I think in a normal case, let's take it out of the Trump, let's take it out of the political context. Let's just say a normal person was charged with drug trafficking in the state. And then the feds piled on, or vice versa. What if the feds charged somebody with drug trafficking and then the state said, we're going to charge them with the same drug trafficking? You'd go, why? How's that a good use of resources? How's that fair? The other point that people say is, well, but Fani Willis's charges can't be pardoned, right? Federal charges, if Donald Trump wins or another Republican wins, they can pardon it, or try to at least. I guess there's a question mark whether a president can pardon himself. But Fani Willis's state level charges can't be pardoned. But I wrote a piece this weekend where I basically said, I'm not so sure it's prosecutors' business to worry about pardons and try to foil pardons. That's the chief executive's job under the Constitution. So I do have my reservations about Fani Willis's indictment. And, if you're all for it, I guess a lot of this comes down to where are you coming from? If your position is Trump just needs to be crushed no matter what, no matter how, then sure. And by the way, by that logic, then also state and county level prosecutors in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada, they should all be piling on their charges too. I think that's fairly ridiculous. Again, prosecutors shouldn't just engage in massive pile-ons. Where I tend to approach this is I absolutely believe Donald Trump needs to be held accountable. And I think the indictments that we saw from Jack Smith are well supported, both of them. But I also I'm not on board with let's crush this guy by any means necessary. Let's bend the normal practices. Let's do things the way we wouldn't normally do them because it's him. And it needs to, and it's so important that what I hear people is he has to be held accountable. Yes, but he has to be held accountable within our normal rules and due process.
Yeah, I agree with that. So Elie, let's stay on it because what has stood out from the in Georgia indictment, specifically in the charges, 18 people charged in this, obviously former attorneys of his from Jenna Ellis, Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, the fact that this case took so long, like what has really stood out? And can you kind of break down the charges and Georgia's RICO statute, which again, I am not familiar with as a criminal justice minor?
The breadth of this indictment is what jumps out at me. The fact that she's charged, is it 19 people, 41 charges? Racketeering is a tool that I used to use all the time as a federal prosecutor. It's similar in Georgia, but it enables you to prove, basically you have to prove to the jury this was an ongoing criminal enterprise. This was a group of people working together to commit a series of crimes. The downside is you have to do extra work as a prosecutor. It makes your case more sprawling. The benefit to that is you get to show the jury the full extent of the criminality. I do think this charge will ultimately prove out to be overbroad. I don't think she's going to wind up with 19 convictions. Let's put aside Trump. I do think it's hard to identify what exact conduct some of these folks engaged in that's not just bad or disloyal or disreputable, but criminal. Take Jenna Ellis, for example, right? Jenna Ellis, the attorney. I'm no fan or admirer of hers as a lawyer. I think she's a terrible lawyer. I think she was dishonest. I have all sorts of problems with her. I'm not so sure she did anything criminal here. She engaged in atrocious lawyering, and she really pushed the boundaries of what a lawyer can ethically do. But did she commit a crime that requires her to lose her liberty and be locked up behind bars? I'm not so sure of that. So, the indictment is sort of the easy part, relatively speaking. Any prosecutor realistically can indict just about anything. I said at the prosecutor's office, we used to say we don't go out to celebrate an indictment. We go out to celebrate a conviction. So the other thing here is I don't think we're going to see these charges tried under any circumstances before the 2024 election. People have I was shocked to learn just how slow the Georgia courts move, just how slowly a trial moves. I mean, Fani Willis has a different RICO case right now with far less known people than Donald Trump. Everyone's less known than Donald Trump. They are in month 7 of jury selection. So, I mean, how long is it going to take to pick a jury in this case, to try this case? It's going to take years. And of course, if Trump wins, all bets are off. I don't think any of these cases proceed if he wins the presidency. So she got a big bang for the buck from the initial indictment and announcement, but now the work begins.
Elie, we've had so many different legal analysts on here, like breaking down as each indictment has broken. So now we got 4 cases. We got 91 total charges, felonies and misdemeanors across the board. I would love for you, because we had you, when you were doing your book tour, we had you kind of rank which cases would keep you up at night if you were the former president. Well, now they're all here. Now we have everything all laid out. Can you kind of rank them in terms of crimes, the jury pools that are made up in these different jurisdictions, ones that could take the longest, like you just said, versus the shortest? Like if you're advising the former president, or even if you sat in the prosecutor's chair, like which ones are the ones that this shouldn't take that long? We should get through this. And then which ones are you like, this is going to take forever, like you just said about the Georgia courts?
The 2 federal indictments would be the biggest concern to me if I was in Donald Trump's lawyer's shoes. The New York indictment, the first one, the hush money case, I mean, it's scheduled for trial in March. I don't think it's actually going to go forward. The DA there, Alvin Bragg, who I always have to say just as a qualifier, as a friend of mine, he has signaled publicly that he's willing to come off that date if somebody else needs it. Even if Trump's convicted in that case, it's probably not a jail case. So that one, the conduct is by far the least serious here. That would be last place in all respects in terms of how concerned I am. I think this Fani Willis indictment would be in 3rd place because I would be a little worried about the breadth and scope and seriousness of the charges, but I just think he can put it off for a long time. I think it's going to be certainly not tried before the election. And there's a constitutional issue which is playing out right now about whether, as a DA, she even has the constitutional authority to charge him. The 2 Jack Smith cases are I think the most serious threats. The conundrum there is The most straightforward fact pattern to me is the documents case, the Mar-a-Lago case. That's the strongest facts. You can readily understand what the crime is there. Whereas I think the January 6th case is an interesting theory. I think there's some wiggle room because it doesn't. I do think Jack Smith makes a compelling case that this is a crime, but it's not the kind of obvious, intuitive crime that we're used to. But here's the conundrum. Florida has the best facts, but also a potentially problematic jury pool for prosecutors because Donald Trump won the state of Florida. Even if the pool is selected from the southern counties in Florida, he got 45% in those states. So you're in all likelihood going to have, 3 to 7 Trump voters on your jury. And yes, juries are instructed you're to put aside your political beliefs and all that. But having anyone who stood in front of a jury will tell you they're just human beings and they're not going to decide this case like robots, especially in a couple months leading up to the election. And then you have the Jack Smith DC indictment, which I think is also not quite as clear on its facts, but I think the jury pool there is going to be fantastic for Jack Smith. Donald Trump got 5% of the vote in DC in 2020, 5%. So it's no wonder he and his lawyers have talked about trying to get out of there. I don't think they'll be able to. But so to me, if you gave me the choice of great facts and a so-so jury pool, or so-so facts and a great jury pool, I'll take the jury pool. I mean, that's the reality of trying cases in court. So those are the two that worry me. I also think that if I'm Trump's lawyers, those are also the two that I think are most likely to get tried before the election.
Well, I live in that jury pool here in Florida, so there's a potential for me to get selected for that. More on that, folks. Stay tuned just in case I do. Elie, somebody that's been the ire of Elie Honig, and you've written a book about this man, former Attorney General Bill Barr, said something recently on Fox News that I want to play for you and get your reaction because you just alluded to it before about prosecutors. They shouldn't be thinking about pardon-proofing their cases. You said that last week on the Third Degree podcast. I want you to take a listen to what Bill Barr said recently on Fox News about if he's comfortable with the former president, if he's found guilty of these, the former president sitting in a jail cell, what it means to America. Take a listen to this.
I think the chances are that he will be convicted on some counts. And
can you see him doing jail time?
But I don't think that translates into jail time.
Why?
Because I think, if I was Attorney General and we were prosecuting him, for example, on the documents case, which is a righteous case, I wouldn't want to see a former president in jail. I think a very substantial penalty would serve the public interest, but putting him in jail has too many collateral bad impacts on the country. So I think that's probably where it would end up.
So, Elie, the biggest talking point, again, as somebody who's worked at Fox News, who's put some of this stuff on air, was always about this two-tiered system of justice. And here we have a former attorney general saying that because of who the person is, the former free leader of the world, the former president of the United States, he would have a problem seeing that person in jail. Am I wrong? Is that not a clear-cut example of a two-tiered system of justice? What do you make of the former attorney general's comments there as somebody who's written a book about this man's time for the Department of Justice?
So first of all, I see my book over your right shoulder, Hatchet Man. So thank you for the plug. As much as that book is a harsh critique of Bill Barr's time in office, I actually agree with much, not all, but much of what he has said publicly. I agree with the clip you just played that Trump is likely to be convicted on something. I mean, the guy's got 91 counts against him. I think that in making the argument that Barr is making, he's implicitly conceding that not everyone is treated equal under the law, the starting with the former president. I actually sort of agree with him, but on a different basis. I don't know that I buy. Well, look, I think you cannot ignore the fact that we as Americans don't like the idea, and I write about this in my second book, are a little bit inherently uncomfortable with the idea of putting handcuffs and putting behind bars a former president. It feels un-American. Now, I argue in my book, plenty of other developed democracies have done just that, and they've been fine. But I do think Bill Barr's right that a lot of people would not want to see that. I know there's resistance Twitter, which dreams about it all day long, but I mean real people in the real world. And I don't just mean Trump's most ardent supporters. I think I know people who are of the mindset more or less of, I didn't vote for Trump either time. I would never vote for him. I think he should have been impeached. And I think he should have been removed and convicted in impeachment, but I'm not so sure I love the idea of him being locked up. And that's I think a reasonable opinion. I think anyone who wants to shout that down is out of touch with what real people think and maybe needs to get off of Twitter. Now, I actually think Trump is likely to avoid imprisonment for a different set of reasons, though. First of all, he has to be convicted, of course. You need unanimity. You need all 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. Then he has to be sentenced to prison. Not a guarantee. I think the New York case, for example, he's unlikely to get sentenced to prison. And I think a judge may adopt some of what Bill Barr just said. I don't love, there's ways to punish him. He'll be 80 some years old by then, and short of locking him up. Even if he gets sentenced to prison, if he wins the election, forget it. He'll pardon himself. He'll dismiss the cases. There's no way the state cases will proceed while he's in office. Even if he loses, though, he can then appeal. Let's remember, even if there comes a moment where there's a trial conviction, you've got the appeals court sitting back there, including the U.S. Supreme Court. And people get really mad when I say this. I'm not making a prediction here, but we do have a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court. I don't think the Supreme Court justices care about Donald Trump. I don't think they like him or feel indebted to him. Maybe a couple of them do. But I do think they probably, many of them feel the same way Bill Barr just articulated about locking up a former president. This has been a Supreme Court that's been very broad on First Amendment and very narrow on construing corruption crimes. You add that all together, it's not inconceivable to me that the Supreme Court may overturn a conviction. I know people don't like to hear that, but I'm just flagging it as a possibility. And even beyond that, this one really gets people worked up. Let's say he gets convicted, sentenced to prison, and the conviction and sentence survive all the levels of appeal. There is the possibility of a commutation by a second-term Joe Biden. Think about it. Again, will he do it? I don't know. I'm not talking about a full pardon. I'm saying a sentencing commutation, meaning your conviction stays in place. I'm just going to reduce your sentence, because by the time this all plays out, Joe Biden, if he wins, will be in his second term. He'll be 84, 85 years old. Trump will be 81, 82 years old. I can see Joe Biden, and I've talked to people who know him who said it's possible, maybe not likely, but possible, that he says, look, I beat this guy twice in an election. His political career is over. He's never going to be president again. He's been convicted. Justice has been done. But for some of the reasons Bill Barr just stated and sort of the moving on type thing, I'm going to knock his sentence down from however many years down to probation or something. So my point is there's 4 or 5 separate hurdles that all have to be overcome in order for him to actually wind up behind bars.
Elie, before we let you go, because you just blew out the follow-up I was going to ask you, because we had Joseph Moreno kind of make a prediction about whether he would see any jail time, and he said the same thing you said: appeals, he'll never serve any actual time while he's in appeals courts, and this could drag on, right? So I want to ask you now, all right, Elie Honig is part of the special counsel team with Jack Smith, or he's back, with the New York Attorney General's office. You were a former state prosecutor in New Jersey. So you're working one of these cases. This gets handed down to you. Are you bringing any of these charges across these 4 different jurisdictions? Now that you've seen all the charges, you said how tough they are legally to prove. Does Elie Honig sign off on any of these and says, yes, these are righteous charges, like you heard Bill Barr say, and bring those forward?
Absolutely. The 2 Jack Smith cases, absolutely sign off on the Mar-a-Lago charges, the classified documents charges, and the obstruction, and absolutely sign off on we call it January 6th, but it's really more about the conspiracy before January 6th. But the 2020 election charges, I think they're well crafted. I think they're well supported in the evidence. I think they're necessary. I think they're not duplicative or an overuse of prosecutorial power standing alone. So yeah, I don't want, don't get me wrong. I think people tend to look at these conversations, Mike, as a little bit of like, but who are you rooting for? I actually had someone tweet after I did a segment on CNN the other day, said, I'm really tired of you sometimes supporting Trump's legal view and sometimes not. Pick a side and stick with it. It's like, that is the best compliment I could possibly get, because I don't have a side here. And, what I would urge people to do is let our process play out. I do think these charges are justified, but I also don't think every charge is justified. I don't think it needs to be pile on everything just to bury this guy. I don't think we need to compromise his due process rights in order to get it done. What I'm hoping happens is accountability, but within the existing good faith practices that we have, within our existing procedures, within our existing constitutional rights. Maybe it's like overly naive to think for that, but that's always going to be, my orientation is not going to be, are we going to nail Trump? Or are we going to make excuses for Trump? It's going to be, can we bring him to accountability without undermining our own principles?
One of us took that criminal justice minor and turned it into a major and went through law school. And now he is a senior legal analyst over at CNN and author of 2 books. The other one's the host of this show. Elie Honig, can't thank you enough for coming on the program, my friend. Continued success to you. Stay safe, buddy.
Thanks, Mike.
This episode is brought to you by Kitcaster. Kitcaster books you on top podcasts. How do funded startup founders attract prospects and talent? Podcast interviews. How do entrepreneurs with exits find new deals? Podcast interviews. How do C-suite execs differentiate in crowded markets? Podcast interviews. Kitcaster books you on top podcasts. Click the link in the show notes for a special offer. Celebrate good conversation.
All right, that's our show. Our thank yous to Elie Honig, as always, senior legal analyst over at CNN, good friend of the pod, Third Degree Podcast. Go check out Elie's pod, download it, subscribe to it, go check out his books. For this show, follow us across social media, IG, TikTok, at Can We Please Talk Podcast, on Twitter, at Can We Please Talk. Head to our YouTube channel, type in Can We Please Talk Podcast in YouTube. If you want to see the video, hit the subscribe button for me too while you're there. Audio podcast platforms, you know by now, Apple, Spotify, Google. Shout out to everybody who listens to us on Good Pods. Shout out to Acast, our hosting platform. We can't do it without them. And we can't do it without each and every one of you that listens to this program. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Saveri.
We'll see everybody next time.